It all started on a calm, sunny morning by the lake. The air was crisp, the water still, and I was finally enjoying a peaceful break from the chaos of life. I had pitched a modest tent on my lakeside plot, my land, which I had purchased fair and square, and was enjoying some quiet time outdoors. There was no noise, no partying, no mess. Just me, my camp chair, a fishing pole, and the sound of nature. But in neighborhoods ruled by an HOA and patrolled by self-appointed enforcers, peace is always temporary. That's when she showed up. Every neighborhood has one. Ours has Karen. Now, Karen isn't her real name, but if you've ever dealt with someone who acts like the HOA is their personal kingdom, you already know the type. Hair perfectly blown out at 7 a.m., oversized sunglasses like a celebrity hiding from paparazzi, and a clipboard that probably has more fake citations than real rules. She came stomping down the slope from her house, like she was about to shut down a major crime operation. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She looked at my tent like it was toxic waste. Without a word to me, she started snapping photos on her phone, zooming in, circling around like a wildlife photographer who had just spotted something dangerous. I watched her for a few moments, thinking she might walk away after realizing she had no case. But I underestimated her love for control. Out came her phone again, this time not for photos but for a call. That's right, she dialed 911. I actually laughed for a second, thinking she was bluffing. But no, Karen wasn't playing around. She put on speaker. I could hear her voice rise in fake panic as she told the dispatcher, "There's a man camping on community land near the lake, and I'm not sure if he's dangerous. He's trespassing." I couldn't believe it. I waved to her, saying calmly, "This is my land." But she just turned away like I was invisible and kept reporting me like I was some sort of squatter. As she stood there, feeding the dispatcher her delusional narrative, I grabbed my folder from the car. Inside were all the documents, the deed, a recent survey map, and a letter from the county confirming my property boundaries. The moment the officers arrived, I was ready. But I didn't interrupt her little show. I wanted the cops to hear every word she said. The dramatic delivery, the phony concern for community safety, the insistence that I was breaking HOA bylaws. She even tried to cite some clause about temporary structures, as if a small tent on private land was equivalent to building a casino in a school zone. The officers were professional, but you could tell they were familiar with the HOA circus. They asked for my ID, then asked me to explain what was going on. I handed over the documents, calm as ever. Karen tried to talk over me, waving her phone and rambling about neighborhood standards. One of the officers politely told her to wait. I showed them my deed and pointed out the coordinates on the survey. The officer raised an eyebrow, looked at Karen, and said, "Ma'am, this land belongs to him." You could see her face twist as that sentence landed. She tried to argue, asking for the HOA president, saying this is community-controlled shoreline, but the officers had already checked what they needed to. One of them asked if I wanted to press any charges for false reporting. I declined for now. Karen was still trying to recover from the shock. She wasn't used to losing, especially not to someone who knew the rules better than she did. I could see her processing the reality. She had just called the police on a man who was peacefully enjoying his own property. And now, not only was I not going anywhere, but I had established clearly in front of officers that she had no jurisdiction, no authority, and no clue what she was talking about. After the officers left and Karen retreated back to her fortress of HOA regulations, I stood there beside my tent with a grin that wouldn't fade. The irony was too rich. She had tried to paint me as a criminal, and in the end, she had only spotlighted her own ignorance. But the real fun was just beginning, because while she thought she had the upper hand with her phone calls and imaginary bylaws, I had something much more powerful: actual ownership records and a recent land survey that mapped out every square inch of the property, including a critical detail she clearly didn't know. That detail, the small access road that ran through the neighborhood, including the one leading directly to Karen's home, technically belonged to the same parcel of land I now owned. That's right, the very road she walked on daily, the street she claimed as part of her beloved HOA territory, was actually mine. A few months before this, I had purchased the lakefront property at auction. What wasn't clearly advertised to the public, but was listed plainly in the title and records, was that this property included a slice of private, undeveloped roadway that cut through the neighborhood, long before the HOA was ever formed. It wasn't part of any municipal zoning. It wasn't even properly transferred to the HOA during their creation. Instead, it remained with the original lakefront lot owner, who eventually lost it to foreclosure, and I snagged it for pennies. I've been sitting on this information, watching and waiting, thinking it might come in handy someday. Turns out, that day arrived faster than expected, and Karen had practically invited it. I went back to my truck and pulled out the thick folder I'd been keeping with every legal document tied to the land. Inside were the county maps, tax documents, easements, and even a letter from the assessor's office confirming the boundaries and legal definitions of the parcel. I didn't need to wave it in Karen's face. I knew she wouldn't understand it anyway. But what I did know was that I could do something most people in that neighborhood never imagined possible: restrict access to that stretch of road, including the part directly in front of Karen's driveway. At this point, I wasn't acting out of spite. I was acting on principle. Karen had tried to weaponize the law against me, using false claims and HOA intimidation. All I did was respond with facts. Cold, documented, certified facts. And those facts gave me legal authority over a road she thought was hers. I called my attorney, explained the situation, and asked what I could legally do to enforce my rights to the property. He told me I could place temporary signage or even a physical barrier on the unmaintained portion of the private roadway, as long as I didn't impede emergency services or violate utility easements. That's all I needed to hear. Within the hour, I went to the hardware store and picked up some caution tape, orange cones, and a private drive. No trespassing sign. I wasn't going to block the entire street, just the part that wrapped around my property, the part Karen used to back out of her driveway. When I returned and set everything up, it didn't take long for Karen to notice. I didn't have to say a word. She marched down the road, lips pursed, demanding an explanation. I pointed to the map, showed her the deed again, and said she might want to contact her HOA leadership. That's when her face turned pale. The realization hit her. This wasn't just about a tent anymore. This was about land. And I had it. Her authority didn't extend to me. Her rules didn't apply. Her calls didn't scare me. She could yell, she could threaten, but she couldn't change the paperwork sitting in my glove box and now taped to the cone for public display. Neighbors started coming out. They were curious, some annoyed, some confused. A few whispered that they never even knew who owned that part of the road. One guy even said he'd been mowing it for years, assuming it was community property. I explained the truth calmly and clearly, and let them read the documents if they wanted. Most were surprised, but respectful. Karen, on the other hand, looked like her world was falling apart. Her tone changed. She started asking instead of demanding. That's when I knew the balance had shifted. She had gone from HOA enforcer to someone standing on land she didn't own, with no idea what to do next. After the cones and private drive sign went up, the HOA machine kicked into full gear. Karen wasn't about to take this lying down. She rallied the board, banged on doors, fired off emails, and within 24 hours, I had a visit from 2 HOA board members who showed up acting like they were some kind of enforcement agents. They wore matching polos, carried clipboards, and approached me with the kind of forced authority you usually see in bad reality shows. They didn't start with introductions. They started with accusations. One of them claimed I was violating HOA road access rights. The other said I had to remove my signs or face daily fines. I listened politely, then asked a simple question. Can you show me the HOA's legal ownership of this road? They both froze. I wasn't being sarcastic. I genuinely wanted to see what they had. The truth is, I already knew the answer. I'd done my homework. I'd spent hours digging through county records and land transfers. The HOA had never acquired legal title to the road. It had always been assumed to be common property, but there was no recorded deed, no maintenance agreement filed with the county, and no public easement established. It wasn't theirs. It was mine. The board members didn't have anything concrete to back up their threats, only their tone and the hope that I'd fold under pressure. But I didn't. I handed them copies of the survey and property title, and said they were welcome to consult a lawyer. That's when they started to shift from offense to defense. Their language softened. Instead of orders, they began making suggestions. Instead of remove the signs, they said things like, maybe we can come to an understanding. I didn't respond right away. I let them sit with the discomfort of realizing they weren't in control. What Karen and her HOA crew never expected was to come up against someone who understood how property law works, someone who didn't respond to bluffs, and someone who could back every word up with documentation. The very next day, the HOA sent out a mass. She even tried to take one of the cones down when she thought I wasn't watching. I calmly replaced it and added another sign for good measure. She called a special HOA meeting and tried to rally support to reclaim the road. But the turnout was weak, and several residents questioned her leadership. You could feel the shift happening. The fear she once inspired had turned into fatigue. People were tired of the constant surveillance, the weaponization of rules, the arrogance. My stand had exposed something deeper, that the HOA's authority was far more fragile than anyone realized. Then came the letter from the HOA's attorney. It was sent certified, folded 3 times, printed on fancy letterhead, and filled with paragraphs about community standards and exclusive rights of way. But the kicker was in the last few lines. The attorney admitted that ownership of the road was under legal review and that the HOA would appreciate a temporary pause on any further disruption until clarity is achieved. In other words, they knew they were in the wrong, and they were hoping I'd back off quietly. I didn't. Instead, I sent my own response. Not aggressive, not emotional. Just a firm, well-documented letter pointing out the legal facts and my rights as the landowner. I cited case law. I attached maps. I offered to meet for discussion, but made it clear that any attempt to intimidate or misrepresent the situation would be met with a formal complaint. I CC'd the county and my attorney. From that point on, the HOA went quiet. Not completely silent, but cautious. Their threats stopped. Their tone changed. And Karen? She no longer marched around like the queen of the block. With the HOA silenced and Karen clearly rattled, I decided it was time to solidify my position, not just legally, but physically. I wasn't going to war with anyone, but I also wasn't going to let people keep pretending that the rules they made up on paper could override actual property ownership. So I got to work marking my territory, not with tape or aggression, but with proper, measured action. I contacted a licensed surveyor to come out and mark the property boundaries with permanent stakes, flags, and GPS coordinates. This wasn't just for Karen and the HOA. It was for everyone in the neighborhood who might have been misled about who owned what. The surveyor confirmed everything I already knew. My property included the shoreline, the access path from the lake, and, crucially, the easement that ran directly in front of Karen's driveway. When he drove the stakes into the ground, I stood back and watched Karen from a distance. She was standing on her porch, arms crossed, visibly fuming. But she didn't come down. Not this time. Maybe she had finally realized that anything she said or did could be used against her in a legal sense. Maybe her HOA cronies advised her to keep her distance. Whatever the reason, she stayed silent, though her glare said more than words ever could. Once the stakes were in place, I posted a laminated copy of the survey map on a small signpost right at the start of the easement. I didn't write anything dramatic, just private property, survey completed, see map for reference. That was all it took. Neighbors began walking by slowly, some stopping to read, others pretending not to notice. A few came up and asked questions. I answered each one with calm facts. Most people were surprised, but also fascinated. They had lived under the assumption that everything the HOA said was law. They never imagined that someone could come in and legally own a section of what they all use daily. Karen wasn't done yet, though. The next phase of her resistance came in the form of passive aggression. She started parking her car a few feet further down the street, barely avoiding the property line, and placing her garbage bins just over the stake markers as if daring me to make a fuss. I didn't. I documented everything, took photos with time stamps, and saved them just in case. I wasn't trying to escalate. I was just protecting myself from the inevitable spin she might try to sell the HOA. Sure enough, a week later, she filed a nuisance complaint with the HOA, claiming that my survey stakes were unsightly and disrupting the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. This time, the HOA didn't even bother to approach me. I think they knew better. Instead, they sent out a generic newsletter reminding all residents to maintain visually pleasing property boundaries and to avoid disputes with neighbors. It was weak and vague, a far cry from the bold threats they used to issue with ease. That's when it became clear that my actions had struck a nerve, not just with Karen, but with the entire system they'd built around fear, fines, and flawed authority. To make things even clearer, I invited a few of the neighbors to come see the full survey report and the original purchase documents. I offered coffee, showed them the maps, and walked them through how I came to own the road and easement. Most were shocked, but not hostile. A few were even impressed. Some admitted that they didn't like how the HOA had been operating, especially with Karen acting like she owned the whole community. They thanked me for standing my ground. One neighbor said it was the first time anyone had ever challenged the HOA and actually come out ahead. Still, I wasn't doing it for recognition. I was doing it to prove a point that private property is not subject to HOA fantasy rules, that real ownership is based on law, not on gossip and power trips. Karen's influence was clearly crumbling. Her usual routines had changed. No more clipboard walks, no more loud phone calls on the sidewalk. No more showing up at other people's doors warning them about violations. It was like someone had popped the balloon she floated on, and now she was grounded, forced to live like everyone else. Around this time, the HOA board held another closed-door meeting. I wasn't invited, obviously, but word travels fast in small neighborhoods. Apparently, they discussed the potential liability of continuing to challenge my ownership, the risk of legal costs, and the fact that multiple residents were now questioning their authority. It was a quiet panic spreading behind smiles and carefully worded emails. The power they once held was beginning to unravel, thread by thread, not because of anger or protest, but because someone finally called their bluff with a stack of land records and the patience to wait out the noise. Once the property lines were publicly marked and my easement rights were beyond question, I decided it was time to make one final move. Not to provoke, but to enforce what had already been established. The section of the road in front of Karen's house, technically part of my parcel, had been casually used by her and her family for years. Their vehicles would pull in and out with no thought about whose land they were crossing. It had become routine. But now, with everything documented and official, that habit was going to come to an end. So, I took the next legal step. I filed for a temporary access restriction on the easement space. It wasn't permanent, just enough to make a point and exercise the control I legally held. I posted the notice at the start of the easement, right beside the survey map and property marker, and I installed a removable chain barrier across the entrance. It wasn't aggressive or blocked off with concrete, just enough to require effort and acknowledgement from anyone who wanted to enter. When Karen saw it, her reaction was immediate. She stormed outside, phone in hand, and began recording as she walked toward the chain. She zoomed in on the lock, the signs, the barrier, and of course on me standing a few yards away. She didn't say a word at first, just kept recording while giving me that familiar death glare. Then she started narrating for her phone, calling it harassment and illegal interference with community traffic. It was almost theatrical. I didn't engage. I simply pointed toward the laminated legal notice posted on the pole and went back to what I was doing. Later that evening, I received a letter shoved under my tent flap. Not a legal letter, not even a typed one, just a handwritten note on line paper in all caps saying I was ruining the community and making life harder for everyone. There was no name, but the handwriting and tone made it clear who the author was. I kept it as part of my documentation, just like everything else. I wasn't trying to ruin anything. I was simply holding the line. For too long, Karen and the HOA had operated unchecked, making up rules, enforcing them inconsistently, and using fear and confusion to control everyone. Now, they were being asked to face reality, and reality didn't bend to their opinions. The driveway access restriction worked faster than I expected. The next morning, Karen's husband had to reverse awkwardly into the street and circle around to park elsewhere. He didn't say anything, but I could feel the weight of his annoyance in every movement. That inconvenience, that minor disruption, was exactly what I intended. Not to cause harm, but to force recognition. The road they thought was theirs had a new owner now, and that owner wasn't going to let them forget it. Over the next few days, Karen stopped using her driveway altogether. She began parking on the far side of her lawn, creating an eyesore that probably broke her own HOA codes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Other residents started asking questions again. A couple of them wondered if I was going too far, but when I explained everything, most of them saw it differently. One neighbor even laughed and said, "Honestly, it's about time someone showed them they're not invincible." The HOA board, however, went into full damage control mode. They sent out another mass email saying that certain property complications are being reviewed, and they encouraged all residents to remain civil and cooperative during this process. They didn't name me, but it was obvious who they were talking about. Their tone had shifted from aggressive to cautious, from demanding to diplomatic. By now, Karen had lost her status as the enforcer. She no longer acted like she ran the street. Instead, she began making little attempts at negotiation. She came by one afternoon and asked if we could come to a reasonable agreement about the driveway situation. She didn't apologize. She didn't even acknowledge her earlier actions. She spoke carefully, like someone who knew they were walking on a tightrope. I listened without interrupting. She tried to offer compromise by suggesting she'd refrain from filing any more HOA complaints if I just removed the barrier. But I wasn't interested in trades. This wasn't about tit for tat. It was about setting boundaries, literally and figuratively. She didn't like that answer. Her expression twisted again, the way it had when the police had told her she was wrong weeks earlier. But this time, she didn't yell. She just walked away, and for the first time since all of this started, she looked genuinely defeated. Not angry, not outraged, just resigned. Because for the first time, her attempts to control the narrative, the property, and the people around her had completely backfired. And now, every time she looked out from her porch, she saw a small but immovable reminder that she wasn't in charge anymore. Not of the road, not of the rules, and certainly not of me. With Karen retreating into silence and the HOA operating in damage control mode, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. What had started as a simple tent pitched near a peaceful lake had turned into a full-blown reckoning for an entire community structure built on assumption and intimidation. The HOA, once feared for its warning letters and mysterious bylaws, was now exposed for what it truly was, a paper tiger relying on fear instead of facts. And Karen, its loudest enforcer, had unintentionally handed me the torch to dismantle their authority just by overplaying her hand with a 911 call. Word spread fast beyond just my street. People started talking, not just whispering but actively engaging. Neighbors began asking more questions at board meetings, questioning decisions, demanding transparency, and pulling records. Someone even posted a copy of the plat map I had displayed outside on the community bulletin board, highlighting the stretch of road that I owned. The discussion shifted from what I had done to what else the HOA might have been misrepresenting. For the first time in years, people were no longer afraid to challenge the board, and the ripple effect was something even I hadn't anticipated. I received messages from residents I barely knew, some thanking me, others cautiously asking for advice. They wanted to know how to check their own property lines, how to access public records, what exactly the HOA could or couldn't do. These were people who, for years, had accepted every fine, warning, and restriction without hesitation. Now, they were waking up to the possibility that their rights didn't end with the HOA handbook. It all started because one person asked, "Is that really your tent?" and got an answer she wasn't prepared to hear. But with that new awareness came an equal amount of resistance. The HOA wasn't going down quietly. They tried to recover their footing by doubling down on vague legal language. They started sending out memos full of words like reassessment, community impact, and provisional authority. None of it meant anything concrete, but it was clear they were trying to create confusion again. The same tactic that used to work so well: blur the lines of truth, wrap it in official-sounding language, and hope people wouldn't look closer. This time, however, the fog wasn't working. Residents had tasted the truth, and they weren't ready to go back to blind compliance. Karen, too, made a few feeble attempts to regain her relevance. She held a neighborhood safety meeting in her front yard, complete with folding chairs and a printed agenda. Only 3 people showed up, and one of them left halfway through. She talked about preserving values, protecting shared space, and made not-so-subtle jabs about those who abuse technicalities. But the weight of her words was gone. Everyone could see through it. She wasn't leading. She was grasping. Her former power, based entirely on fear and perception, had collapsed under the weight of reality. Meanwhile, I kept my routine. I didn't boast or escalate. I just maintained what I had already established. The stakes stayed in place. The chain across the easement remained where it was legally allowed, and the laminated documents never moved. I responded to inquiries calmly, shared my records openly, and didn't react when small provocations were thrown my way. My strength didn't come from aggression. It came from the quiet, consistent application of truth. That's what made the difference. Karen and the HOA had always relied on noise. I responded with proof. Eventually, the HOA stopped sending memos altogether. The board changed its tone in newsletters. Karen stopped walking the neighborhood with her clipboard. Meetings became shorter, less dramatic, and far less attended. People realized they didn't need to sit through hours of vague threats and passive-aggressive lectures when they could simply stand on what they legally owned. What had once been a tightly wound system of control started to unravel with every neighbor who refused to be bullied. Even city officials started taking notice. The local assessor's office reached out to clarify the road boundaries after receiving multiple inquiries from residents trying to confirm what land they actually owned. A planning commission member even thanked me informally at a town meeting for helping residents reconnect with the property records process. This wasn't just about one street anymore. It was about how communities operate when people are uninformed and afraid, and how quickly they can change when someone chooses not to play along. What Karen never understood is that power built on paper, fear, and assumptions cannot survive the weight of truth. And when one person decides to stand still and not step aside, it exposes just how fragile those structures really are. It wasn't just her driveway I blocked. It was the entire illusion of untouchable authority she had been hiding behind for years. Now, every time someone walks past that chain, they don't just see a boundary. They see a reminder that ownership matters more than intimidation, and that silence isn't the same as submission.